I was in university in Trinity College Dublin. I was about to graduate with a business studies and economics degree. I'd been involved in rowing. That was the sport I got involved in. I'd been rowing both for my university and also internationally. And I also had a job offer to start in an investment bank after graduation. So in April 1998, kind of everything was going my way. I had the graduation about to happen, the rowing was going well, the job offer was in place, and life was very much going to plan. It was all going my way. That was April 98, and within days I went from that person who knew exactly who I was and where I was going to someone who was completely blind and was starting a completely new life. In the space of 2 weeks, I went from someone who could see, who had a great future ahead of them, to someone who, well, couldn't do anything for themselves. Back in, it's just over 8 years ago now. I'm as blind can be. I'm 100% blind. I can't see anything at all. If I look directly into the sun, I can see nothing. So I suppose it's like being in a dark room with your hands over your eyes. Sometimes I can see swirls of light when there is no light. So I suppose the only thing that I can remember was being in a dark room with my hands over my eyes and rubbing my eyes and getting those swirls of light that you get whenever you do that. I was in university in Trinity College Dublin. I was about to graduate with a business studies and economics degree. I'd been involved in rowing. That was the sport I got involved in. I'd been rowing both for my university and also internationally. And I also had a job offer to start in an investment bank after graduation. So in April 1998, kind of everything was going my way. I had the graduation about to happen, the rowing was going well, the job offer was in place, and life was very much going to plan. It was all going my way. That was April 98, and within days I went from that person who knew exactly who I was and where I was going to someone who was completely blind and was starting a completely new life. In the space of 2 weeks, I went from someone who could see, who had a great future ahead of them, to someone who, well, couldn't do anything for themselves. Back in, it's just over 8 years ago now. I'm as blind can be. I'm 100% blind. I can't see anything at all. If I look directly into the sun, I can see nothing. So I suppose it's like being in a dark room with your hands over your eyes. Sometimes I can see swirls of light when there is no light. So I suppose the only thing that I can remember was being in a dark room with my hands over my eyes and rubbing my eyes and getting those swirls of light that you get whenever you do that. I was born short-sighted, which gives you a tendency to have weak retinas, or retinas that can detach from a knock on the head, or just spontaneously detach. And at the age of 5, I went in for a routine checkup on my eyes, the doctors noticed that I'd had a detached retina and not noticed it. So I lost the sight in my right eye when I was 5. As I grew up, I had a detachment in my then good left eye, which was fixed. I had a cataract, the lens was taken out, another detachment, some laser treatment, a range of different glasses from short-sighted through to no glasses after my cataract operation. And then by the age of 22, I had a final detachment which the surgeons couldn't fix. So I suppose it all started with being born short-sighted, followed by a number of detached retinas from footballs in the eye, a frisbee in the eye, bangs on the head, and eventually, at the age of 22, I lost the sight in my left eye, my only remaining eye. At the start of April, I was just about to do my exams in university, and also coming into the racing season in rowing. And I remember it was a Thursday afternoon. We were down at the river training. We were actually doing some gym circuits, and they were quite intense. And I remember halfway through having to go outside because I was getting blurred vision around the edges of my field of view, and I would never sort of break from doing circuits. Going out for a rest in the middle of a training session is just not something that I or any of the guys would have done. But I suppose I must have realised something was wrong, and I went outside for a rest, I suppose, to take stock of what was going on, and didn't resume the circuits. I headed off home on my bike, actually. At the time, went down the next morning, on the Friday morning, to go for a training session on the river in the boat, and having cycled down to the boathouse, down to the river from where I was living in Dublin, my eyesight the blurring was still there, and I knew something was going wrong, or just wasn't quite right. That was on a Friday. 2 weeks later, I was in Manchester having an operation from which I never recovered. So I suppose from initially noticing that there was something wrong with my eyesight to going blind, really it happened in the space of 2 weeks. And from within that 2 weeks, it just gradually got more and more clouded, more and more blurred, until I had the operation, came out of the operation, and I couldn't see from that point on. I certainly struggled with the blindness for a period of time. Perhaps I'm still struggling with the blindness. I don't want to be blind, but for a short period of time I didn't really face up to it. I denied what was going on. I was angry, impatient. I was praying for some kind of miracle cure, and I definitely felt sorry for myself, but I didn't get depressed. And as research demonstrates, most people, in fact, wouldn't get depressed if they went blind. Most people who deal with or face major trauma in their lives, and we see it on the news all the time, most people deal with it and get on with their lives, and I am part of the huge majority of people who have faced a challenge in their lives and have dealt with it and got on with life. After the final word that the surgeon wasn't going to be able to do anything for me, and my arrival back in Northern Ireland, I was very much at a new starting point. Absolutely everything, every single thing I did was new, from leaving my bed to finding the toothbrush, finding my way to the bathroom to find the toothbrush and the toothpaste, finding a watch that I could read, walking down the stairs, boiling a kettle of water, leaving my house. Everything I did was new, and it was, you know, in some ways it was very difficult, but in other ways I was making great progress. I felt like I was getting small wins most days during that period, and I found it very frustrating when I wasn't progressing. But within maybe 2 weeks, by the end of July in 1998, I had found out that blind people use computers, can use normal, standard, off-the-shelf computers, and can put on a piece of software which allows the computer to read out exactly what's on the screen, word by word, letter by letter, font size, colour. I use word processor, spreadsheets, email, the internet, and my computer talks back to me. So I got onto a computer course to learn how to use the speech software with a computer. I learned how to type within days. I just visualized the keyboard and pictured it in my head and learned how to type. For years I had not been able to type, and I used to pay people to type essays for me in university. So I was getting small wins all along the way. I got a white stick after a number of months, which was a major step, because it was me saying to the world, I suppose, that I am a blind person now. I've got a white stick, and that's the symbol for blind people. That was a major step in terms of the rehabilitation. A real point, I suppose, that it was me admitting that I was blind, admitting to myself and everyone around me. I applied for and eventually got a guide dog, a cross between a Labrador and a Golden Retriever, which was another huge step forward in terms of independence. And once I got what I described as the blind toolkit, the living skills, the white stick, the guide dog, the computer, I was very much ready to start on rebuilding my life. Eventually got an opportunity to start in a job in central Dublin in Ireland. And I suppose from that point, early 1999, within maybe 6 or 7 months of going blind, I was living by myself, armed with the blind toolkit, and working. And it was all a progression. And as I say, it was small, insignificant wins, but I was at least progressing all the time. I say insignificant because it's insignificant to me now. I can read a watch and I can get about by myself, but at the time it was almost exciting in some senses. I think one of the most difficult things is swallowing your pride and accepting the help that I have to avail of. Anytime I cross a road that I don't know, I've got to ask someone if they can help me across the road, or they can tell me if there's a car coming or not. When I'm traveling, I get a taxi, get to the taxi myself usually, and then get the taxi driver to pass me to the check-in desk, the check-in desk to pass me to the air hostess, the air hostess pass me to another taxi, and then eventually to my hotel, where I get taken to my room and told what the room is like. So if I'm traveling from Dublin to New York or Dublin to Hong Kong, I have to accept and ask for help every step of the way. And it's a game of pass the parcel, me being the parcel. But if I was to get annoyed about having to take that help, if I was to be worried about accepting that kind of help, I would never leave my house. So it was one of the most difficult things to accept, but one of the most important things which I had to accept. I was certainly progressing in my sport from junior rowing. I was a junior international in school, rowing for Ireland. in university, I'd been racing in my university boat, and I'd also been racing for Ireland at the home internationals, which involves England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. I'd also been selected for a World Championship squad by the time I was 21. So I was certainly progressing within my sport. And by the age of 22, that's when I suppose I was cut short on my rowing career. It took a while to get back involved with rowing. It took 3 years to get back in a boat, and I suppose it was an ideal sport for me to be involved in, because you actually, you sit with your back to the direction that you're going. So I was able to get back involved and race in events that I'd raced in before I'd lost my sight. And eventually I got onto the Northern Ireland team and raced in the Commonwealth Games, where we eventually got a silver and bronze. So it was the normal, or I should use the phrase, I shouldn't, I don't think you're allowed to use normal. I think you have to be more politically correct than that, but I tend to use language that I would always use. So I competed in the normal Commonwealth Games, and we got a silver and bronze there. But it was very important, I suppose, at that time, it's very important to me to not automatically live in a disabled world because I'd happened to have lost my sight. I wanted to adapt the things that I had to adapt being a blind person, but I wanted to live as normal a life as possible. And I suppose that's what I was trying to do in the first 4 years after blindness, as I rebuilt my identity. After 4 years, I had rebuilt my identity. I was living a life that I wanted to live. I knew I could work. By 2002, really the summer of 2002, I'd had 2 different jobs. I had handed in my master's thesis. I'd got my medals at the Commonwealth Rowing Regatta. I'd raced in Henley Royal Regatta in England. I knew I could do all of the things which I could do before I lost my sight. It was actually a very, very difficult time, because it was a blank sheet again. Whenever I went blind, I didn't really have to do any goal setting, because it was almost hardwired into me. I just wanted to be that person that I was before I lost my sight. But after 4 years, having achieved all of that, I had to ask myself, well, what next? What am I going to do now? I finished my master's, I've done the rowing, and the company that I'd been working for had gone out of business. So I was very much scratching my head thinking, what's the future going to hold for me? And I was 26 at that stage. So I started in university. I was doing an economics course, and I was asked to go and speak to an oil company about my experiences of going blind and rebuilding my life and getting involved in the Commonwealth Games campaign. And having gone in to do that lecture, and I really enjoyed it, and I met some interesting people, I started to investigate the whole speaking and training business. During that time, I met a guy who'd done a race in the Sahara called the Marathon des Sables. It was 6 marathons in 1 week in the Sahara, and I was still rowing at that time, but it sounded fascinating. I didn't think that I would ever do 6 marathons in a week in Ireland, never mind a desert. So I started to investigate the different races that are available around the world outside rowing, and I came across a race called the Gobi March in northwest China, to be held in September 2003. And I suppose that the fascination of 6 marathons in 1 week, it kind of captured me ever since I met one person, and suddenly 2 people and 3 people and 4 people who had done these types of events. So within a year, I'd entered the Gobi March and was out there racing. So I suppose the move from rowing into running and running in deserts in the North Pole, that move started with just a simple fascination, the challenge for challenge's sake. I just didn't know if I would be able to complete one of those events, and I suppose I wanted to test myself or challenge myself. And luckily myself and the guy that I was racing with, the guy who guided me in the desert, luckily we finished the race and achieved our goal. How does a blind person do 6 marathons in a week? I most certainly didn't know the answer to that when I entered the race, but number one for me always when I'm getting involved in any sporting event is who's going to have to find out who's going to do it with me. And the rowing, it was Brenton Smith. The Gobi Desert event, there were a few people who were thinking about getting involved, but they came up with excuses not to do it. And the guy who did guide me in the desert, a guy called Nick Wolf. Now, when I say guide me in the desert, Nick did all of the race with me. I ran along either holding onto his elbow or being attached to wrist with a piece of cord or string, and Nick had to describe to me every step of the way, really, because the Gobi Desert isn't just sand. There are rocks and boulders and dried riverbeds and mountains and grassland and sand dunes. There's ice. There's absolutely everything in the Gobi Desert. And not only did Nick have to do the race himself, but he also had to speak and communicate with me every step of the way what was going to be under my feet. So anything from a tennis ball sized rock to a rock that was going to hit in against my thighs or my hips. So Nick was probably, his vocal cords were probably tired by the end of the race rather than his legs. But I always have to find someone to guide me in whatever race I'm doing. The first major event that I did was in the Gobi Desert, and it was 40 degrees Celsius. It was very, very hot, very, very dry. After that event, I wanted to contrast it and do another running event, but this time in snow and ice conditions. And a number of months after the Gobi Desert, it was actually on the 6th anniversary of when I'd gone blind. It was the 10th of April 2004. The North Pole Marathon was being staged, the first marathon, official marathon in the North Pole, was being held, and myself and a different guide, a guy called John O'Regan, we entered that event with 13 other people and went up to the North Pole with on a Russian cargo plane and did a race up there in the cold. So I suppose the North Pole, not only was it the anniversary of me going blind, but it was also in contrast to the heat of the Gobi Desert. I was in search of a cold running race, and we certainly got it in the North Pole. It was, I read different things about how cold it was. We were told at the time that with the wind chill it was down to -60. I certainly know that whatever temperature it was very, very cold, and ice was forming on our eyelashes. When we were breathing in, ice was on the inside of our nostrils. It was just absolutely freezing. We were running in thermals, waterproofs, face masks, goggles, hoods, hats, snowshoes, and we did a marathon up there. But to go on from that, I again had another change at that point, and there were lots of interesting people up doing that event. There was a guy an American guy called Sean Birch, who was an Everest climber and somewhat of an explorer in the mountains. Sir Ranulph Fiennes, the explorer, was doing the event. There was another guy called Brent Wiener from the States who had done, I think, 150 50 ultra marathons, lots and lots of interesting people up doing the event, and I started to get bored with the running. It seems ridiculous to say that I was bored having been at the North Pole. It was absolutely an amazing experience, but I wanted to get involved in other sports, other adventure type races, and by chatting, sitting around in a tent at the North Pole, listening to all these other people's stories, people were talking about doing kayaking races and adventure races, triathlons and Ironman triathlons, and that kind of captured my imagination. So I went off and learned how to kayak in Ireland. I entered a race in New Zealand which involved called the Coast to Coast, which involves running, cycling and kayaking, and now I'm doing a swimming, cycling and running event in Switzerland. But I suppose I should, it's probably worth saying that ever since the blindness, really, my whole story in the last 8 years, there was very much a low point with the blindness, but everything went reasonably well after that blindness. You know, I rehabilitated, got a job, went back studying, got my medals in the Commonwealth Games, got a business off the ground, got things moving in my life, and eventually I entered the Coast to Coast in New Zealand and probably started to push the boundaries, or maybe I expected too much of myself. But I went down to do the event expecting to be able to finish it, because I had finished the Gobi Desert and I'd finished the North Pole race, and I kind of expected to finish the Coast to Coast. But having done a 3-kilometre run, 55-kilometre cycle, I started into the mountain stage, which I thought was going to be difficult enough, but no more difficult than the Gobi Desert. And after 11 hours of climbing and scrambling and going up a mountain, I missed a time cut-off and got helicoptered off the mountain. The helicopter arrived at the finish line. Most people had finished the race and I hadn't. I was just too slow, and everyone was clapping and congratulating me for at least having a go. And it was probably right back to a low point. I didn't go down, and I don't do the events that I do not to finish them. I don't do them to fail, and that failure was probably one of the more difficult things to deal with, in, I suppose, either before I lost my sight or since I've lost my sight, because I generally set things that stretch me enough, but I don't fail at. And the Coast to Coast in New Zealand was something which I just couldn't finish, and it actually annoyed me so much that I went back to try and do it a second year, just this year in 2006, and again I got helicoptered off at the same point. So I think that's my fill of the New Zealand race, and I'm going to accept that I can't finish that particular race. So most things are going well for me, but there's the odd failure in there as well. For an event like the Gobi Desert, there were 58 other people involved in the project, apart from myself and Nick. Those people got involved because we communicated with our friends, people around us. We communicated what we were trying to achieve to lots of different people. People got involved either because they wanted to help us out directly, simply to help us out, or in some cases because they had their own agenda, whether it was the guys who came along and made a documentary. That wasn't simply to help myself and Nick out, that was because they wanted to further their own careers, which was fine. We had a journalist who came along with us as well, who wanted to further his own career. Ultimately, that helped us get a sponsor on board, which helped the whole project to happen. So I suppose we have two types of groups in a team that help us achieve our goals. The informal team, which is usually much bigger than the formal team. For me, the formal team was myself and Nick. The informal team was 58 other people. Whether it's 2 plus 58 for every single project, I don't think so. In the North Pole, we probably had a much smaller team involved in that project. When I was writing my book, I knew that I wasn't quite up to the mark in terms of writing skills and grammar, so I got a friend to co-write the book with me. There were probably 15 people involved in that project. Again, simply because I started to communicate what I was trying to achieve. Myself and Ross, in terms of the book, myself and Ross were the formal team. The informal team were the people who we perhaps interviewed and helped promote the book. Right back whenever I first went blind, it became very, very clear to me that there was no point in talking about it or looking for some kind of solution or wishing it away. There was a fact there, and that fact was that I was blind and that everything had been done to solve my blindness. Everything had been done and nothing could bring my sight back. So there was a point right at the start where I had to make a decision to either feel sorry for myself or not face up to it or blame other people. I could do that, or I could decide to accept the facts, face up to it. And I think that lesson is probably one of the most important lessons that I've learnt and has carried through to my sporting endeavours and my study and everything in my life. We don't always like the facts, but the starting point for me is the decision to face up to those facts. So that would be lesson 1, decide to accept the facts as a starting point. The second area is around attitude. What do you do when you've accepted the facts? Do you just leave it there, or what do you do next? And again, in all aspects, dealing with the blindness, the sport, the study, writing my book, whatever it happens to be, as soon as I decide what I want to do, as soon as I decide what the goal is, I can immediately write the excuses why I'm not going to achieve that goal. So I can come up with excuses which can prevent me from achieving the goal, or I can look at those excuses and be very honest with myself and say, well, can I come up with solutions for those excuses? And more often than not, excuses are just problems that we can solve. Once we take the excuses away, once we take the problems away, then we're in a position to make it happen. So the decision around attitude, the decision which I'm talking about there, is whether we decide to be someone who searches out solutions or whether we decide to be someone who just looks at the excuses and leaves it at that. The third area brings me back to the question of why, being very clear on why we're doing what we're doing, why we're pursuing the goals that we're pursuing, why we have the attitudes that we have, and the decision being whether, based on an understanding of why, whether we decide to persist with a course of action, with an attitude, with a goal, or whether we decide to change direction. So the decision is whether to persist or change. That's the third area. And the fourth area is, in some senses, in slight contrast with the first three, because the first three decisions that I talk about and the three things that I try to communicate are very much in relation to individuals only. The decisions that they make, whether it's to accept the facts around attitude, whether they make excuses or make it happen, whether we decide to persist or change, that's all to do with the individual. And I haven't mentioned anyone else in relation to that individual just yet. However, the fourth area stems from the fact that I had to, right at the start, whenever I first went blind, I had to make the decision to accept the fact that I was blind. I had to be very clear that I wasn't going to make excuses, that I was going to try and come up with solutions, and I had to be very clear about why I was doing what I was doing, whether I was going to persist or change. But I notice and very much understand that in the last 8 years I haven't actually achieved anything without the help and support and sometimes criticism of other people. So the fourth area which I concentrate on is the decision to communicate with the people around us, to let people in, to tell people what we're trying to achieve and allow them to bring their expertise to the table. So the decision whether to communicate or keep it a secret is the fourth lesson which I speak about, and which I suppose I try and live myself. And those four lessons, those four sets of decisions are the things that I think about in relation to any project, any goal that I have, any problem that I'm facing, any challenge that I face. I always come back to those four things. Am I accepting the facts? Am I making excuses? Do I need to be a bit more honest with myself? Should I persist with this, or should I change? And fourthly, do I have the right people around me? Am I telling the right people? Am I letting the right people in to this project to help me make it happen? And those are, in summary, the lessons. The blindness has perhaps forced me to reflect and think about what's important to me, what I want to do with my life, and right now I suppose I describe myself as doing projects that fit in with my overall goals in life. I sat down a number of years ago and thought about what matters to me, what I want to do. I call those kind of strategic goals, and I wanted to travel, I wanted to make my own decisions, I wanted, in terms of my job, I wanted to travel, I wanted to play sport, I definitely wanted to earn money, and the projects that I'm involved with now are allowing me to satisfy most of those goals. When I go and do a marathon at the North Pole, or whenever I enter a race in Switzerland to do an Ironman triathlon, I have a very clear understanding of why I'm doing that. And I always try to be able to answer that question of why am I doing, or I ask myself, why are you doing this particular project? So in terms of my job, I'm constantly asking myself, why are you bothering to do that? Why are you bothering to get up to train? Why are you bothering to enter that particular event? Why are you not doing the things which you said that you wanted to do? So I suppose at all times I come back to the question of why am I doing what I'm doing? If I can't answer the question, if I can't give a good, solid, honest answer for why I'm doing what I'm doing, then I have to question it, and I have to see, is it right for me? And if it's not right for me, well then it's time to change direction, it's time to do something different. I can look at my life in starting 8 years ago and moving till now, 8 years on, and everything that I've done has been a progression from absolutely not being able to do anything at all by myself to progressing along a track, whether it's the sporting track, whether it's living by myself, whether it's getting a job, whether it's studying, and all of it has, I suppose, has culminated or together. Maybe it seems like a lot, but all of it has happened simply by taking one step at a time. So I happened to be interested and into sport, going to the Gobi Desert and doing the marathon, 6 marathons in a week, just seemed outrageous before I did it. But having done that and completed it, going to the North Pole didn't seem that outrageous to me, because I suppose I had a stock of experience at that time in sport and maybe in marathon running. Having been to the Gobi Desert and the North Pole, the next step to New Zealand or to do an Ironman triathlon doesn't seem that outrageous. So I suppose if someone has never done any sport at all, from the outside looking in, these events might seem absolutely extraordinary. But I look at lots and lots of other people and think, wow, I'd love to be able to do what they do or what they have done. They may look at me and say, wow, I'd love to have been in the North Pole. So I suppose my experiences and what I do, I'm very much used to used to doing them, and I'm very comfortable doing them. So if they seem extraordinary to other people, that's interesting, but I don't see myself as extraordinary.